Hey, what's going on, everybody? So this is part 4 in a video series of which we take a look at the lawsuit that the Osundairo brothers have filed against the attorneys for Jesse Smollett. And basically, we're going to analyze this lawsuit. And just to make sure everyone is aware, I'm not a lawyer. I'm not licensed to practice law. I didn't go to law school. This is basically my own opinion under freedom of speech and basically for entertainment and educational purposes only. So if you haven't seen the Unsundario brothers, here they are to the left. If you haven't seen Jussie Smollett, which it'd be surprised if you haven't, here he is to the right. So here is the second count of their lawsuit. And basically, before we get into this, we want to take a brief look at false light, what it is. If you're like me, you've never heard of a false light claim. I found an article on Fine Law, and basically, false light is a claim that can only be made in certain states. Illinois is one of those states where you can make a false light claim. Um, Now, basically, the elements of defamation uh, is that for defamation, the plaintiffs must prove the following elements: the the defendant made a statement about the plaintiffs to another. The statement was injurious to the plaintiff's reputation. The statement was false if the plaintiff is a public figure or was involved in some newsworthy event or some other event that engaged the public's interest. The defendant must have made the false statements intentionally or with reckless disregard of the plaintiff's right. There are no applicable privileges. I'm not exactly sure what there are no applicable privileges mean. This is a little bit puzzling, but we're just going to set it aside for now. So the elements on false light, however, in a false light claim, the plaintiffs must prove the following elements. The defendants published some information about the plaintiffs. The information must portray the plaintiffs in a false or misleading light. The information is highly offensive or embarrassing to a reasonable person or of ordinary sensibilities. The defendant must have published information with reckless disregard as to its offensiveness. A false light claim is usually easier to bring than the defamation claim. So the difference between false light and defamation, where defamation is meant to protect a person from injury to their reputation, false light is meant to protect a person from the offense or embarrassment that arises from a misleading or untrue implication. Now, I'm not actually sure if there's a difference between these two statements. One just says you're protecting a person's reputation. The other, the false light, is meant to protect the actual person. But to me, it looks like the damage would come to the person through their damage of their reputation. So I don't know. I don't know that that makes sense. The core difference leads to the practical differences that affect how the parties approach an issue of reputational harm. A defamation statement need only to be made to one other person, but a false light disclosure must be made to a large enough group of people to be considered a public disclosure. Okay, so now this looks like it's stating the clear difference. It looks like in a defamation suit, I could probably make a false claim about you to your friend or to someone who knows you, and then that one person may go back and tell you, or maybe they'll publish it or something like that. But based on the fact that I made that claim to one person, qualifies it as defamation, whereas false light, it looks like it has to be made to a broader audience. So you can sue for false light if it's made to a broader audience. I don't know. I'm just making some conclusion from reading this one line. Defamation is meant to protect a reputation. A non-offensive statement about a person can harm their reputation. As such, defamation does not require that the statement be offensive or embarrassing. False light, on the other hand, demands that the supposed implication of the offense be embarrassing. Again, a little confusing here. I'm not sure what the difference is between a statement that is not offensive and embarrassing that could damage a person's reputation versus an offensive statement or embarrassing statement. Uh, to me, the end result is still the same. You're being harmed by a statement made by that person, no matter if it's offensive or embarrassing or not. So I'm not sure, what the difference is. I'm pretty sure there's a lot of lawyer types out there that could explain it. If you can, please do. False light demands that defendant has made an implication or misleading statements or disclosure with reckless disregard. This is a high standard. This is interesting because it seems like it's contradictory or there's a catch-22, because here it says there is a high standard for false light, but above it says a false light claim is usually easier to bring than a defamation claim. So it's going to be interesting to see how that is kind of litigated in this situation. Defamation, on the other hand, only demands reckless disregard standard if the plaintiff is a public figure or a limited public figure. Truth is a complete defense to defamation. False light is affected by truth defense differently. A defendant's true statement about a plaintiff may not be used to save the defendant if the implication is false. However, if the defendant's implication about the plaintiff is true, then it will serve as a false light claim. So there you have it. So that's the difference between false light and defamation of character. Honestly, I'm not sure if I completely understand the differences, but for the most part, to summarize this article, it looks like false light is going to be easier to prove, and you're basically saying that the defendant implied some misleading statements about you that basically hurt you in some way, whether or not it was malicious or offensive or embarrassing. Now, in this case, I'm not going to read the entire count to you on YouTube here, but I have read it. And essentially, let me see if I can just pull out some highlights. I know for a fact that this claim is actually saying that the lawyers for Jussie Smollett lied about some of the things they said regarding the plaintiffs. I know that they're claiming that they're implying that they sold Nigerian steroids, and I know that this count is claiming that one of the Osundairo brothers had a homosexual relationship with Smollett. Now, in particular, count 2 is directed as Ms. Glendane. There are several other counts preceding this, and those accounts are directed to Garrigos and Garrigos and his law firm. So just highlighting some of the claims. Mrs. Glendane made false statements to third-party press and the public that plaintiff used whiteface both in the past while committing hate crime. Let's just skip through some of this. Ms. Glendane made false statements that plaintiffs are illegally distributing foreign steroids. Moving on, Ms. Glendane made false statements that the plaintiff, Bola Osundairo, engaged in homosexual acts with Mr. Smollett. Statements falsely accusing plaintiffs of illegal activities, including committing a hate crime, committing perjury, and intentionally making false statements to the police and distributing steroids, are objectively offensive. Let me just skip through some of this. Ms. Glendane explicitly identified plaintiffs in making these offensive, untrue statements. Even when she refers to them as the brothers, they are still easily identifiable. So that's essentially what count 2 is stating, and it's directed to Miss Glendane. Count 3 is essentially the same count as count 2, or the same claims. It's just directed to a different party. It's actually directed to Ms. Garrigos, and again, I'm not going to read it all here on this video. If you want to read it, you can basically definitely Google the suit, and you can read it yourself. But Mr. Garrigos repeatedly indicated that the plaintiffs conspired to criminally attack Smollett, and by doing so, implied the plaintiff committed perjury before February 20th, 2019. Grand jury conspired to make false statements to the Chicago police. And it goes on and on, essentially stating some of the same things in the previous count. And then the fourth count is essentially the same thing, but it's more geared towards the law firms that hired Mr. Garrigos and Mrs. Glendane. Additionally, Mrs. Glendane above torture statements were made in consort and coordination with Mr. Garrigos in an attempt to promote his law firm and the reputation. Mr. Garrigo's torturous statements explicitly identified the plaintiffs in making these untrue statements. Even when he referred to them by pronouns, they are still easily identifiable. Mr. Garrigo's statements were made after the close of Mr. Smollett's criminal case, did not serve any legal function, and were not required of his job as a defense attorney. So I'm going to basically end the video right. Actually, let's see here. So this is essentially it. The fifth and final count is basically, let's see, the plaintiffs hereby reallege and incorporate their allegations, blah, blah, blah. At all relevant times, the defendants Tina and Glendane Mark Garrigos were acting within the scope of employment as employee and partner respectively of Garrigos and Garrigos law firm. So basically, count five does some final work in binding the actual law firm. So essentially, count two attacks basically alleges that the Miss Glendane, who is Tina Glendane, basically alleged that she's made some false statements, and then count three does essentially the same thing, but it's towards Mr. Garagos, and then count four is basically a continuation of one of two and three, and then count five is potentially binding the actual law firm. So I'm actually just trying to sum this all up. So this is going to be the fourth video. Please leave any comments below, and do subscribe. The fifth and final video will talk about possible strategies for both the plaintiff and the defendants here.